I'm your host, Jeff Zart. We're going to take you behind the scenes with the craft distillers who are pouring their heart and soul into crafting the next version of America's spirit. This is the Great American Whiskey Cookers.
Yeah, so we like to say if you taste our whiskeys, particularly if you taste our bourbon series, which is all from the same mash bill, you're going to taste the history of the 19th century. First of all, you're going to taste what bourbon was like originally. And modern bourbon and the original bourbons are nothing alike whatsoever. Most people don't realize, first of all, bourbon was initially made in Virginia. It was made there as a corn-based whiskey that was shipped in charred oak barrels. Where do they get that from? Nobody knows for sure. Right. But we believe it's something they observed because it was something that was used for aging cognac, and cognac is what was brought by the French fur traders in the region. Also, we think the name comes from that. Old bourbon is what they called the region, and so that was often put on the barrels. But when they first moved to Kentucky Territory, which I believe was in the 1780s, they went there for the limestone spring water, maybe to avoid federal excise tax. But the main thing they were doing was they were commonly using the limestone spring water because of its lack of iron. And many distillers within a couple of years were there. And so once Kentucky becomes a state, they carve out a section of the big county they're in, and they create a new county called Bourbon County, which some people think is where the name comes from for the whiskey, but that's sort of backwards. It's probably named after the whiskey. And so this style of whiskey would have been made from corn, a wide variation in mash bills, from all corn to maybe just barely 50% corn. This whiskey is also named after an important historic site, which is about 1,000 yards from here, called Bourbon Spring.
It's actually called Bourbon Spring.
It's called Bourbon Spring.
And why?
That's a long story.
Here we go.
But it's an important one. So remember I told you about these two fur traders, the Lawton brothers, had the tavern over here? Okay. All right, so the fur that was being traded throughout North America, and particularly around here, was beaver. Beaver was a big commodity because it's what you made felt hats from.
Sure.
And that's because it was the only felt that kept weather off your head. By the time you get to the 1830s, the beaver have been all essentially hunted out. In fact, Des Plaines was a major beaver. By then there probably weren't any beaver left. And so the entire beaver hunting industry collapses in the 1830s. That's the end of it. So what's happening during the 1830s in this area is that the American settlers are moving into homestead for farming. Okay. But this isn't happening just here. It's happening all throughout the Midwest. And as a result, there is more pressure for land in competition with the indigenous peoples in the area. And in many states, the way that is dealt with, this is called the Indian problem, but it's actually the Indians' problem, meaning it's American settlers.
Yeah, right.
They end up, in many states, essentially forcing treaties to get these different groups to relocate to less desirable lands called reservations.
Right.
Now, Illinois decides they are going to be, I guess, more progressive. They are not going to have reservations. Instead, first of all, they allow any of the indigenous peoples, if they want to keep their land, to do so. But if they want to keep their land, they have to have it deeded. And to deed your land, you have to give up your tribal hegemony. On the other hand, you can sell your land. And if you can't sell it privately, you can sell it to the state. And then you have, if you want to keep your tribal hegemony, you have to relocate to one of the territories into a reservation, which was either Iowa or Kansas. Now, what if you wanted to keep your tribal hegemony and keep your land? Well, that wasn't allowed. But there were many tribes who wanted to do that, including the Fox Indians who are out to the west from here. And they end up fighting to keep their lands, and thus begin in 1832 what are called the Indian Wars of Illinois. For the next 2.5 years, General Scott, who actually sets up camp over here for his Illinois volunteers, ends up fighting the Indian Wars, and particularly with the Fox, with a very famous warrior chieftain who had come over from Michigan called Black Hawk. Mm-hmm. So they're fighting all these Indian wars, and then eventually they drive off all these recalcitrant tribes into the territories, and then the Indian Wars are over. And General Scott comes back, sends all the volunteer home, and that is the end. But that means there's no standing army in the state of Illinois. And by the way, by law, federal law, every state has to have a standing army. That's what the National Guard is today. So Illinois had to form a militia. So Cook County, largest county in the area, they have to form a militia. And so they end up having the first sheriff of Cook County, his name is Steve Forbes, sends a letter out saying, all the able-bodied men have to come to my home to form a militia. Steve Forbes' wife is the sister of Barnabas Lawton's wife, so they are in-laws. So he is homesteading right out here near the tavern. And while he's building his home, he's staying with his in-laws, which means he's staying at the tavern, which means he just invited all the able-bodied men in Cook County to the largest tavern, most popular tavern in the state, which means they show up. So 1,023 men show up at Lawton Tavern, which was the single largest meeting to date in Cook County, and they elect this guy, Jean-Baptiste Beaubien, the first colonel of the Cook County militia. Now, Beaubien is a second citizen of Chicago in 1818. He's a very wealthy fur trader. Now he's a very old, wealthy fur trader. So he's very popular. And when this happens, he writes about it in detail in his diary because it was so important. He said that one of the men elected him was largely ceremonial, but being at a tavern and in high spirits, the men wanted to drink. So one of the questions is, how would you drink your spirits in the early 19th century? And the answer is you seldom drank them straight because they were usually pretty rough. You would mix them with something, and the most common way to drink a spirit would have been in a punch. Now, punch comes from the Sanskrit word for five, which is really weird until you realize it was popularized around the world by the East India Trading Company because it's what they sold, the tea or spice, mixed into what they drank, the Navy grog. That was sugar and water and spirit and some lemon and lime juice so you didn't get scurvy, add tea, and now you have punch. And we know they served a lemon tea punch because Beaubien wrote the recipe down in his diary. He wrote down how many lemons, how many loaves of sugar, how many packets of tea. Because those would have been very expensive ingredients in 1835. And he said they made the punch in an empty bourbon barrel, and then to keep it cold, they put it into the nearby spring, Bonnefontaine. And thereafter, the spring was known as Bourbon Spring. And if you go down to the side of the spring today, which is right down by the river here, there's a limestone cistern there with a bronze plaque on it that says Bourbon Spring. We get to remember it as the name of our little baby bourbon, which is why there's a little barrel in the spring. So that's, I think, a really nice story. It tells us all about the history of this place long before there was Riverside.
And it gives a history of it.
And gives a history, and it ties to this style of spirits. After the Civil War, the whole industry has to rebuild, and that's when Illinois has the opportunity to become a major bourbon-producing state. Because the single largest alcohol-producing city in the country will become Peoria. And that's because the river is there. The river is spread from the south by Limestone Springs. It's a good river to be used, river water to be used for that purpose. It's surrounded by cornfields. The train goes through there. Everything goes through there. So it makes perfect sense. In fact, in 1868, the single largest distillery in the world is built there by General Distilling. And years later, that will be bought by a company called Hiram Walker to make their very, very, very popular, but very, very, very cheap bourbon whiskey called 10 High. And they'll make that until 1959 when they finally go out of production. In 1980, they leave Peoria for good. So Peoria today, mostly because of Prohibition, doesn't have very much importance in distilling for spirits, but it once was the center of the production of liquor in the United States. So in the 1890s, the biggest bourbon maker at the time, A.H. Taylor, he spends 5 years trying to lobby to get a law put in place called the Bottled and Bond Act of 1897. And that law is basically a deal they make with the federal government. It says, hey, in return for not selling the whiskey until it's 4 to 8 years old, we will do the following things. Number one, we will keep it in a bonded warehouse and distillery. That's a surety bond insurance policy, so the taxes are paid. 2, we will bottle in the presence of a federal officer, which we don't have to do today. 3, we will bottle exactly 100 proof, so we're not excessively diluting it, and it's easy to make the measurement with a single precision hydrometer. Next, we will only bottle one season of whiskey, so we're not going to be doing a young whiskey blended with an older whiskey. Yeah. And then finally, we'll put a tax stamp on it and put it back into the bonded warehouse, and that will be labeled Bottled and Bond with its year of production or age. And that becomes the standard for high-quality whiskeys going into the 20th century, the Bottled and Bond. And it is the only whiskey now in that series that's bringing us back closer. Let's get this one. This is our 4-year-old Bottled and Bond.
Okay.
This is the end of the 19th century. This is now starting to get a level of oakiness approaching the level of oakiness of this baby bourbon.
Got it.
And if you sit and taste through these things, you're tasting through history because these are all the same high corn mash bill. When we make our whiskey, it's 84% corn and 9% barley malt and 7% rye malt. That would have been a typical mash bill for a farm distiller because you had to buy your malts, and what you had to get rid of was all that corn.
Right.
So they taste all completely different. And the difference is how we've aged it. Same mash bill, same whiskey. We don't even know what the whiskey is until we go to put it into the barrel. And in fact, we don't even know what it is until we decide to annotate from the barrel. And It's amazing, and we thought maybe we'd only end up picking one of these.
Sure.
But they have different flavor profiles. We have some people who love this 2-year-old because of its light sweetness. We have some people who like the wooden bite that's from the tannins in the center of the 3-year-old. We have people who prefer the 4-year-old bottle and bond because of its complexity, and it's starting to get enough oak on it again.
And again, this is a business decision. This is you're purposely trying to do this. You're not rushing out a product.
It's business and passion. No, it's not that. We could have dropped this product. This product is more expensive to make.
Right.
We could have dropped this product. We don't because we think this is a really good product. And we have a lot of people like it.
Yeah, and that's important to understand is what's the distiller going for when you make a particular whiskey.
And if you're playing this game where you're trying to not just vary the mash bill or flavor product, this takes a long time to figure out. We're 11 years old. It took that long to figure out what we know now about aging in different barrels for different amounts of time. You can't guess this. You have to try it. In fact, we continue to let this product age. And when it got to the 5th year, it closed up. This sometimes happens to whiskeys the way it does when you're aging wine in a bottle.
Yeah.
The whiskey seems to be improving or getting more interesting, and then suddenly it's actually less drinkable. It closes up. And then you just have to hope, if you sit in the barrel longer, it's going to taste better.
So you get on your knees and pray, like, please get better.
Because we had 3 barrels, I think, going through the 5th year, and we were like, nope, no good. 6th year, well, getting better, but no better than the 4-year-old. We didn't get to something we thought was interesting enough until we got to the 7-year-old. So that's the 7-year-old bottled in bond. So we just released this fairly recently. The main feature is a more intense, complicated oakiness to it.
Sure.
And I think it's interesting. I actually like my 4-year-old a little better. And the reason is, again, because of an intentionality. We're about trying to get maximum grain flavor by using a simple pot still.
Okay.
And that intense corn flavor that I have in here, this starts to become dominated by the oak once you get to be older.
So
in fact, that's what a modern whiskey is about. Modern whiskeys are made in tower stills. They have less grain flavor in the base spirit, and more of the flavor that gives them their complexity is from the aging in oak.
Right.
And recently people have gone for older whiskeys, which means they're going for oakier expressions, and then eventually soften up the oak when it gets too intense. And that's sort of what we had to do here as well. So this is getting closer. In the 19th century, they would have done a bottled in bond between 4 and 8 years old because they never figured anybody would want to drink anything older than 8 years old at the time.
Right.
That's a very modern thing. And I like it and I sell it, but I still personally like the 4-year-old bottle because I get more of its corn flavor. And it's like, if you're going to give me a high rye bourbon, maybe that's cool. But if you're going to give me rye. My personal preference. And I make what I like.
And again, number one, you make what you like, but when it comes to whiskey, it's what's your personal preference?
Right.
What are you going for?
What are you going for? Right. So that's what inspired what we've got here. We do a couple of other things, and we do other variations of it.
I hope you enjoyed this session, this history lesson with Derrick. I'm Jeff for the Great American Whiskey Cookers. See you next time.
Thank you. And that's
like history, don't you?
I do, which is really fun because I'm a physicist.
You're a physicist
by
trade?
Yeah, I'm a retired physicist. I have a biophysics undergrad. I have a history undergrad. I have masters in physics and material science. I have a PhD in physics, and now I make booze. But people get into this industry from all walks of life.